Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the evening section, the Friday evening section of the Yukon Conservation Society Caribou Celebration. Thank you very much for coming out on a Friday evening. This evening we have two events. We have, first of all, we have Lorraine Netro is going to tell us about her experiences in the effort to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Lorraine is a Vuntut Gwitchin citizen. She was born in a tent in the village of Old Crow. She and her 5 sisters were raised by her late mother Mary Netro in Old Crow. Their childhood years were spent mostly out on the land in their mother's hunting and trapping camp. The traditional teachings of her mother and grandmothers was the foundation that helped to lay the strong connection to the land, animals and waters within their traditional territory. Lorraine tells me that she feels humbled by the many achievements that she's had in her life, given that she comes from very simple but rich beginnings. Lorraine served as a member of the Legislative Assembly for Vuntut Gwitchin, and she served as Deputy Chief for the Vuntut Gwitchin government. And she served as the Vuntut Gwitchin representative on the Arctic Council and on the Porcupine Caribou Management Board, and has been the Yukon representative and vice chair on the Assembly of First Nations Women's Council, and has advocated for protection of Ishik, Gwatsan, Gwandal, Gudlit. How's that? The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the calving grounds of the Porcupine Caribou Herd for 18 years now. So, Lorraine, after Lorraine's finished her presentation, or her talk, there'll be some room for questions or comments from the audience, and then we're going to show a film called The Refuge.
Masi Cho, thank you so much. Hat at Gwinzi, Shalakat. And thank you for that introduction. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Kwanlin Dun and Ta'an Gwitchin First Nations, and we appreciate them hosting us on their land to talk about this very, very important issue of the caribou. And I would like to also thank the Porcupine Caribou Management Board and the Yukon Conservation Society for inviting me to speak to you tonight, Masi Cho, for all your good work. And before I begin, I would also like to acknowledge all those who came before me to educate the many people throughout the world about our plight with the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the Gwitchin people trying to protect the calving grounds of the porcupine caribou. As we learned today, there was lots of good information that was presented us today, and we even had a feast of porcupine caribou meat. And that was so special. I was really honored to be part of all that took place here today. And it educated all of our people in the Yukon. I was born and raised in Old Crow, and in the introductions, I was raised out on the land with my mom and my 5 sisters. And never in my wildest dreams did I ever think that my experiences out on the land, having the freedom to play out on the lakes, that was our playground, and out in the wilderness, that experience would be so beneficial for our advocacy work that we do today. The Gwitchin people, the Gwitchin nation spans from our neighbors in Alaska and our neighbors in Northwest Territories. And within our Gwitchin nation, there's about 8,000 Gwitchins. And most of our people live out of the land. We might live a modern life, but we have the best of both worlds. In 1988, there was extreme pressures in the United States to drill for oil and gas in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, right in the core calving grounds of the Porcupine Caribou, which is in the northeast section of Alaska. And our people gathered in Arctic Village. People from every Gwitchin community within the Gwitchin Nation gathered in Arctic Village, Alaska. And it was at that gathering that the elders gave direction to the young people in our nation to educate the people in the United States and the world about the porcupine caribou, what it means to our way of life, and what it would mean if there ever was oil and gas drilling in the core calving grounds of the porcupine caribou. Our people, the Gwitchin people, rely solely on the porcupine caribou for our food. And we use every part of the caribou when it's harvested for our clothing, for tools, and more especially for food. It has sustained the Gwitchin people for thousands and thousands of years. The ancient trails, which is the migratory route that's imprinted in the land in our traditional territories throughout the Gwitchin Nation, tells that story. And every spring and every fall, the caribou migrates past our community of Old Crow. And there's so much excitement in the air when that happens, because now we know we're going to have food to sustain us over the season. So going back to 1988, there was some people that was chosen within our Gwitchin Nation to advocate and educate the people within the United States and go directly to Washington, D.C. So with the advocacy work that we do, we have a process. People within the Gwitchin Nation travel from each of our communities at different times to travel to Washington, D.C. And earlier you heard Joe Tadlici talk about our brother, Lenny Combe. He sacrificed his life and walked with the Gwitchin people to help educate the grassroots people of the United States. And my friend Lena Tadlici is sitting there. She's traveled also with Lenny. So we leave our community and we go to our designated states or Washington, D.C., and we work with nonprofit organizations. And in Washington, D.C., we work directly with the Alaska Wilderness League. They are our eyes and ears in Washington. They keep watch of the political environment. They know and they sense who would be willing to stand with us in our efforts to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Once a year, they hold an event. It's called Wilderness Week. And During Wilderness Week, there's several people that come to Washington. They volunteer their time, and we spend 4 days with people, grassroots people like you. They know very little about who we are as Gwitchin people. Yet, what they're in their hearts, they know how critical and how important it is to protect wild places. Ajik Watsat Gwandai Godlit is the sacred place where life begins. That's what the Gwitchin people call the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It's a biological heart that feeds the caribou, that provide a sacred place for over 200 species of birds to nest every spring. It provides a sacred place for the polar bears and the wolves. It's a sacred land to us as a people and to the animals. And for that reason, they stand with us. Because for those 200 species of birds that go to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge every spring to nest comes from many different places across the United States. Every state within the United States has a bird that flies to the Arctic Refuge. So we have people that walk with us from every walk of life. And we stand together. We meet them on day one. We're strangers. And by the time we leave, we're very good friends. And during our time in Washington with them, we educate them about our way of life. We share our stories about what the caribou mean to us. We talk about our ancestors, our mothers, our fathers, our grandmothers, our grandfathers. The teachings that have been given to us and handed down from generation to generation. And the responsibility that we feel, the responsibility that I need to take to make that trip and to help educate people about what it means if there ever was oil and gas drilling in the core calving grounds of the Porcupine Caribou. That would devastate our people. That would devastate our very way of life. We share that story also when we visit the offices of the senators, the offices of the congressmen and women. We don't get to meet them too often in person. We get to meet their environmental assistant. And their environmental assistant is very young. They're very young people. They're smart. And they too are the future generation. And so we encourage them and we ask them directly to support no drilling, no resource development in the calving grounds of the Porcupine Caribou. And for what I usually share with them is I say, you know, it takes me 3 days to come make that trip from Old Crow to Washington, D.C. And they're very surprised. I usually have a little map that I show them where I'm from. Then I point to I show them the Alaska-Yukon border. And I say, our family and friends are just right across the border. And our elders tell us that they do not recognize that border that was put there by the federal governments. Because the border is not going to divide us as a people. We are united in everything that touches our nation, and we stand together strong. And they listen. And sometimes the people that come, the volunteers that come and travel to Washington, D.C. from the different states across the United States, they come there because they're concerned about the birds. They're concerned about protecting wild spaces. And they don't realize that there's a people that's going to be impacted. So when we meet them, they're very surprised. When we share our stories with them and we say, you know, we rely on the land. We rely on the animals for our food. We rely on clean waters. And that connects us. That connects us as human beings. That we do have a responsibility for future generations. We've seen many, many ups and downs and all arounds with this issue. Our people started advocating 30 years ago. That's a long time. And I believe today that we are very successful because there's no one up there yet. We have managed to keep the oil and gas companies out of our sacred lands. And it's not easy to do. We have to take the time and educate and build that relationship and keep that relationship strong. Let's not go down there, make a trip there, and then just come back home and hope everything is okay. It does not work like that. We need to always be in communication, always be in connection with the people who we work with on a daily basis. We need to know what's going on at the political level. We need to know who supports our issue and those who don't. There are times when we go and visit at decision makers' office and they say, no, we can't support you right now. And that's okay. We say, thank you, Masi Cho, thank you for your time. Because next time we come back, something might change for them. And we have to be consistent. and make sure that the Gwitchin have their voice at the forefront. And we need to make sure that we have that commitment. I traveled to Washington, D.C. day after the election, November 9th. When I was on the plane, I landed in Seattle. I had some time, so I sat in the, to have some lunch. And some people joined me. The atmosphere, the energy, you could just feel it. I was feeling it. I was in shock at what had just happened. And the people that I came in contact with, the people who I spoke to that day, were not very happy. They were walking around in shock too. And the next day at our meeting, I had to support the people who I was with. I had to reassure them that, yeah, things didn't turn out the way we thought it would. The election results wasn't in our favor. But we're not giving up. It just means that we have to work harder. And those words that we share with them as Gwitchin people, with the grassroots people of the United States, sometimes doesn't come from us. That strength and courage that we need sometimes to uplift people and have that hope and have that faith doesn't come from us. It comes from our grandmothers and our grandfathers. And it's there when we need it the most. I went back to Washington in December, and we started strategizing about how we're going to move forward. And from that time until now, I'm here to tell you that we are successful. No matter what the political environment is like in Washington, D.C., we are successful. 2 weeks ago, there was a bill that was introduced in the House of Senate for protection of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And for the first time in history, there was 40 senators that stood up and say, we do not want drilling in the Arctic Refuge. In that political environment. That is amazing and truly awesome. That speaks volumes of what is taking place on the ground. We do that work quietly, consistently. And we continue. That's what we need to continue to do. The representatives from from the state of Alaska has never been in support of the advocacy work for protection of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. From the day that the election results came out, there was headlines in the newspapers every day right up until now. Okay, there's a clear path to the Arctic Refuge now. They've introduced bills that they want to drill for oil and gas in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And those bills has never been passed. And the work and the advocacy work that takes place today, our young people, our young Gwitchin leaders are now on a journey with us. Just last month when we traveled to Washington, D.C. for Wilderness Week, there was 4 young Gwitchin leaders from Vuntut Gwitchin that traveled. And mentoring them and letting them know what to expect. They already know in their heart because they had teachings from their grandmothers and grandfathers. And that's only a little part of our journey. And the only reason that we're successful in what we do is because we work with people who live in the United States, the grassroots people. The work that we do today is going to impact generations, our future generations. I have 4 beautiful grandchildren. When I first started sharing my story, when I first went to Washington, D.C., I said, I'm here because one day I hope to be blessed with grandchildren, and now I have 4. And it's not even about them anymore. It's not about my little 9-year-old grandson, he's my youngest. It's about his great-great-grandchildren. Any decisions that we make today in regards to our traditional territories, in regards to our way of life, we need to think about 7 generations from now. And it's each of our responsibility to take on that role and to educate our young ones. And along the way, we met many, many beautiful people. Our relatives, our friends, our family from Alaska and Northwest Territories. We continue to do this advocacy work. We continue to walk with each other. And I hope we don't have to do that too long, but given the environment that we're dealing with today, it might take a little time, a little more time. many of the people who blaze this trail for us have journeyed on to the spirit world, but they have also guided us. And we'll continue to do this work until we're successful. And I just wanted to share a little bit about our journey with you tonight. And say masi cho again to everyone for coming and listening. Masi. Maybe I'll just share a little bit more information that I didn't relay. Within the last week, there was a leak in the pipelines up at Prudhoe Bay. I think we all seen that in the news. And those kinds of headlines really build a lot of fear within our people. We see exactly what can happen. And it's just right there in front of our eyes. And especially at Prudhoe Bay is very close to the calving grounds of the Porcupine Caribou. And of course, after they try to get it under control, then they try to cover up and say, oh, it wasn't that bad. Any kind of leak is bad. Any kind of spill is bad. Any kind of contamination to the lands is not good. No questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
So I've watched and admired the work that the Gwitchin all across the north have done for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge for a long time. And I know that when the struggle started, this was before you had a self-governing First Nation or anything like that. And I was always impressed at how people from a little tiny, isolated, if you like, community like Old Crow, which you wouldn't have thought to be a particularly cosmopolitan, sophisticated place, and yet they send people down to the capital of, what at that time was the world's preeminent nation, and fought them to a draw. And that's really, really impressive. But what I really wonder, that question to you, is what did that experience do to the people of Old Crow? How did that affect them? Because it must have been a very powerful learning experience that came back to the community. You must have wound up with a group of people who had acquired a very unusual set of skills. So could you comment on that?
Thank you for that question. That is a good question. We, one of the things I need to mention is it's really difficult to talk about ourselves like that. Because the work that, the advocacy work that we do, when our elders tell us, when we talk about our animals and our lands and our waters, we have to be careful how we relay that message, the language that we use. And we always have to speak with respect and treat people with respect. That foundation has been laid for each of us. The teachings that we got from our mom and dads, our grandmothers and grandfathers helped to lay that foundation. And they help to instill in us what is important and what our responsibility is. So when we take on that role and decide to travel, it's when I share this story with people in the United States, as we try to build a good relationship with them, I say, you know what, we must have been a fearless people. Because we hop on that plane, yes, it's fearful. We land in a big city. And then we get to meet a lot of people, we get to share our stories. It's sometimes hard to put words to those kind of experiences, because it's not about us. We're just a messenger. We're the messenger for our people, to educate people who need to hear our story. And we do it over and over again. And because it's in our blood. Because our very, very way of life is at stake. The future of our grandchildren is at stake. And we take those journeys because we have a passion. We've seen many cities and we've seen many small communities along the highways. You know, I can say I've been there, but there wasn't a time that I had time to do sightseeing. So yes, we've traveled many miles.
Hello, Shicha.
Hello.
I've heard lots of stories about your travels and stuff, but I just realized that you never really did say, not that I heard anyway, what it felt like when you first walked into whatever it was, the Senate or the House or, the congressional hearing or whatever it was, and coming from where you came from, maybe you could just go into, you came from packing water to wash your clothes and to drink and all that and everything else to going to, something like that. It must have been a pretty profound feeling.
Yes, it certainly was. I remember my first trip to Washington, D.C. I was coming off a 2-week tour on the road with our dear little brother, the late Lenny Combe. So we traveled throughout Illinois and Indiana. So by the time we got to Washington, D.C., we were tired, because we travel miles and miles on the highway. By the time we get to the destination where we're going to do a presentation, just in a room like this sometimes. Sometimes there are 200 people, sometimes there's 50 people, sometimes there's 500 people. And Lenny showed his slideshow of people across the Gwitchin Nation. And then as a Gwitchin representative on his tour, we get to share our story. And so On my first trip, I was always interested in doing this advocacy work. So I raised my son, and my son became a young man, and now I had an opportunity. And this beaded piece that I'm wearing, I started preparing myself before I put my name forward. I started sewing my regalia. I spent hours and hours with my mother and other people in my community, and to let them know what I was going to do, what I was planning. And they shared stories with me from the history of their own history of their families. And that whole process gave me strength and courage. But getting on that plane and then, you know, at the end, meeting up with Lenny and then ending up in Washington, D.C., we go through a little bit of training. They let us know what to expect. And when I had my first meeting in one of the decision makers' offices, I felt very afraid. I felt insecure. And I felt I wondered if they would really understand. I wondered if they would understand how important this decision that we're asking them not to do, how important that was for our people. And so I shared my story with them. I say, I come from Vuntut, Gwitchin. I come from the Yukon. I'm from Canada. 5 minutes. I had 5 minutes to ask them for their support and why it was so important. Thousands and thousands and thousands of years my people lived from our lands. And I had 5 minutes to tell them why they shouldn't drill in our sacred territory. I left that office, I cried. I went into the corner and I cried. Pulled myself together and then went to the next meeting. And it has been like that over the years. It's very, very emotional because of what's at stake. And yet it truly builds your strength. It truly instill in me how very important this work is and how important it is to continue. Marty, for your question.
Yeah, thank you for your really powerful words. It's even sort of tough to ask questions with such powerful statements that you're making. I was wondering if you have information on sort of what the perspectives or attitudes are of sort of Alaskan people. Is there a lot of awareness around the significance of the 1002 lands? You know, if you were to go to Anchorage and talk to people, I mean, do they know about the threats that, or the consequences of drilling up there? And, you know, is there a chance to really mobilize them to become allies in this?
we have the Gwitchin, part of the Gwitchin nation that lives in Alaska. And they stand and we stand in total unity with each other as Gwitchin people. Their representatives from Alaska don't share the same kind of feelings that they have for this special place. Time and time again over the last 30 years, they've never once stood up and say, we stand with you in protection of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And of course, the people in Alaska are well aware. You know, over the last 30 years, if you talk, I believe, to any one person from grassroots United States, they're going to know about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Because it's been in the news, they've been educated, they heard the Gwitchin people talk and share about how important it is. And what we try not to do, what our elders ask us not to do, is get in conflict with people from other jurisdictions. We talk only about our experiences, and we can only, what we can refer to is that they're not in support of no drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And it's written all over the, newspapers and the headlines. And so they know what they need to do. They are mobilized. The Gwitchin Steering Committee has an office in Fairbanks, Alaska. The Alaska Wilderness League has an office in Anchorage. Several offices in Anchorage. So yes, they're aware.
So actually, in partial answer to Jason's question, we have a 15-minute movie that we're going to show right now called The Refuge that was made by the Patagonia clothing company, came out late last fall, and it features the Gwitchin people from Alaska in a fairly large role. So I'm just going to cue that up and we can watch that. After we've seen this film, then Julie Frisch is going to come up and present. What is that? It's going to present a book called The Dempster, A Road to So Much More. It's a production that it's in the way of a re-release of a film that was brought out. Of a film, sorry, I'm trying to do two things at once and I'm just terrible at it, so I'll stop. It's a re-release of a book that was originally brought out in about 1979 when the Dempster Highway was first opened. And anyway, so that's going to take place immediately after we watch this film.
Oh, use the mic. I do have something to say, of course. So my name is Julie Frisch, and I am a member of Friends of the Dempster Country Society, which a lot of you probably haven't heard of, but you've probably all heard of the Yukon Conservation Society. I'm also a longtime member of the Yukon Conservation Society, which is part of this whole story. And I want to thank the Conservation Society and PCMB, the Porcupine Caribou Management Board, and Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation for putting this whole thing together. How many of you were here this morning? Okay, so there's a lot of you. We talked a lot about the winter range and the importance of the winter range of the porcupine caribou. And the calving ground is, of course, incredibly important, but as Yukoners, we know that come winter, it's important to survive the winter also. So it's really, the winter range is in our backyard, it's in the Yukon, and it's up to us And is Larry here tonight? No. It's up to us. Larry was here this afternoon, and we gave him a bit of a hard time. We have to speak out for our backyard, for the winter range of the Porcupine Caribou Herd. Anyway, and that leads me into our new book. It seems rather incongruous to be talking about a book that's celebrating the Dempster Highway, because if you were here this morning, the Dempster was one of those impediments to the porcupine caribou when they were migrating in the fall. They often, you know, there'd be a big line. What'd you say? It was 50,000 caribou lined up on one side of the highway, and it took them a few days before one of them, probably a female, got up the nerve to cross, and the others crossed. Anyways, but stay with me for a while, and hopefully you'll agree with me that the Dempster is something that we need to protect and we need to celebrate. And we need to appreciate. I guess that's the main point. So a few years ago, Northern Cross decided that they were going to go exploring up on Eagle Plains. And Friends of the Dempster Country, which is mostly a Klondike organization, we work and play and live up along the Dempster, wanted to do something about bringing to the public's attention that if we don't protect the Dempster, if we don't appreciate it, we're going to lose it. And so the Dempster that we've all known to love, you know, grown to love, we recreate there, we play there, we hunt there, we hike there, could disappear virtually overnight with hundreds of trucks on the road. It'd become a haul road like the road that goes up to Alyeska Pipeline, Haul Road. What's it called? No, the road has got a name. Dalton Highway? Yeah, Dalton Highway. We had a bicyclist from France come by the interpretive center up on the Dempster Highway, and he had just come back from the Dalton Highway. And he said, there is no comparison. After biking on the Dempster, he said the Dalton Highway was awful. He said the Dempster, he felt like was a wilderness experience. So even though they kind of go to the same place, same neck of the woods, they're very different. Okay, so Friends of Dempster was trying to figure out what we might do to bring to the public attention that the Dempster was in jeopardy. And so I happened to be, as a member of YCS, an old member of YCS, I was down in the basement looking for something one day, and this fell off the shelf. And this is a YCS publication from 1984 that George Califf did for the Yukon Conservation Society. I see a lot of faces in the room that were around then, so you probably have one of these maybe tucked away on your shelf. And I thought, you know, nobody's really done a book on all the incredible cultural and natural values along the Dempster since YCS had George do this one. So I called up George. No, I emailed George, being a modern woman, and I told him that Friends of Dempster was thinking about taking his booklet that he did for YCS and messing around with it a little bit, updating it, and how did he feel about that? And he said, go for it. He said, my photos are all still slides. You can't have them. You're going to have to get new photos. I said, that's fine. We went to YCS and talked to Christina McDonald, and not only did she think it was a good idea, but in the end, she wrote our foreword. So I'm just going to read you one little thing out of the foreword. So the Dempster was started in 1959, part of Diefenbaker's Roads to Resources, roads to the kinds of resources, oil and gas that Northern Cross hopes to find up there. It was started in 1959, but then you know, money was spent elsewhere, and it kind of dragged out. And 20 years later, when drilling in the Beaufort Sea was a possibility, then people got excited about finishing the road, and so it was finally finished in 1979. But in the early 1980s, Christina writes, there was concern that the road and associated oil exploration would disrupt the migration patterns and health of the Porcupine Caribou Herd. YCS undertook the original publication with George Califf, to highlight the outstanding natural and cultural values of this part of the Canadian North and build a constituency of informed citizens. So that's 1980. What is that, 37 years, almost 40 years ago. And here we are again, doing the same thing. So we have Northern Cross, we have the Yukon Chamber of Mines, which is talking about even maybe perhaps, as Sebastian pointed out this morning, a small refinery up on the Eagle Plains, you know, just so that we can dig up and use more of the 80% of the oil that the scientists are telling us we should leave in the ground. So it all doesn't make sense, no matter how you spell sense with a C or an S. Anyway, so we, Friends of the Dempster, after 2 years, has finally updated with the help, volunteer help of some of the people in this audience, updated his book, and we now got it at, I think I got it at 8 o'clock last night. I got 2 boxes of books just in time. So we're just, this is the first sales now, tonight. And I'm happy to say that the money from the first sales is going to go to the Conservation Society. So you can help us and help them at the same time by buying a book. And help yourself, because it doesn't say anything about caribou being 1.6 million years in the Yukon in there, but might lead you to look that up on your own. Anyway, so I think that's all I'm going to say. We talked a lot this morning, though, about education and connecting to the land. And to me, the Dempster has always kind of been the way that I see the folks that I call Ma and Pa Canada. You know, they put their kids and their dogs in the old camper, and they can drive up the Dempster. They're not paddlers, they're not backpackers, but they can get into Canada's true north on the Dempster Highway. They can connect with people like Lorraine. They can find out about the living culture of the Gwitchin people and the connection with the caribou. They might not, you know, because they're not there at the right time of year, they might not see the herds of caribou, but they can certainly connect with the land in a lot of ways and hear a lot of stories as they travel up north. So that is my story about the Dempster, Canada's road to so much more. And I hope you'll come out and take a look and decide you have to have a copy.
Thank you, Julie. Marty? So I mentioned earlier, Marty O'Brien is here to present a sneak preview of the upcoming film Camera Trap.
Hello, I'm Marty O'Brien. Originally I'm from Melbourne, Australia, but I've called Whitehorse home for the past 2.5 years now. Certainly. First off, I'd like to thank the Yukon Conservation Society, CPAWS Yukon, as well as CPAWS National, who have supported the post-production phase of this documentary, as well as PCMB, and certainly to Vuntut Gwitchin from Old Crow, who have always been so supportive when myself and Peter Mather have ventured through such genuine and sincere support. So very much appreciated. So 2 weeks ago I went to the first Image Light Festival, First Light Image Festival, which is Yukon's first official photography festival, which was held at the old fire hall in Whitehorse. And there are many, many very talented photographers in the Yukon, and one of those is Peter Mather. It was really interesting going to that event because the first time I met Peter Mather was also at the old fire hall, and he was giving a presentation on a photo essay that he'd been working on for a number of years titled Caribou People. I'm sure at some point you've all seen at least one of those images if you're local. If not, they're very stunning and very unique images. And I think one of the unique things about Peter's photos is their storytelling images, which is really what jumped out at me. And it was really interesting, like sitting there at the talk he was giving. he was talking about his photo essay and showing all these very stunning images and talking about the missing piece to his photo essay. And he went into great detail and describe this very dynamic and unique image that he was going to go and try to get the following winter/spring in Evavik National Park in northern Yukon. And he was describing the image, and I was just thinking, I would love to see that image. And spoiler alert, I'm still waiting to see it. He hasn't got it yet, but I was like, I would love to see that image. That sounds incredible. But what ticked over in my mind was I would love to see how he was going to get that image, because it didn't sound possible. And although he hasn't got it yet, I think it is possible. And we're actually going to be going out again in May this year for his third attempt to get the image, and hopefully the end of the documentary. The image he's trying to get is based off an image that already exists of the Klondikers, gold rushers coming into the Yukon around the turn of the century, coming over the Chilkoot Pass. And in that photo, you might see it in cafes. It's a very iconic Yukon image, but there's a Klondiker in the foreground and very close to the camera, and then tapering off behind him is 200 Klondikers tapering off down like ants into the background of the image. And Peter's goal is to emulate that photo with caribou. So to bring an image that a lot of people are familiar with into the caribou world and to help people connect with them in that way. And I just thought that was such a crazy thing, to have this very specific preemptive image in your mind that you're going to go out to a very, very, very remote area to try to hope that you can convince caribou that do not care about your photography, obviously, whatsoever, and are not particularly interested in cooperating into this frame. It's not the final title yet, but the working title is Camera Trap for the documentary. And it's titled that because he hopes to obtain that image with a camera trap. So that's two receivers that send a laser beam across a trail, and then the camera here, and then when that laser is triggered, the camera will start to take photos. So with a wide angle lens, you can get really intimate, unique imagery, as opposed to a long telephoto lens that wildlife, not always, but typically is taken with. So I was sitting there thinking, how's he going to do that? And the funny thing as well is I was also sitting there thinking, what's a caribou? Because I genuinely didn't know what caribou were until a bit over 2 years ago. I'd heard the name, but I really didn't have an image to put to it, didn't know the significance. I just did not know. And that's really funny to me because since meeting Peter, caribou have become quite a big part of my life. Going on these expeditions with Peter and filming him trying to get this image. I'd like to introduce Tyler Kuhn as well. He's been editing the project. It's been fantastic to have a biologist on board with that perspective. And Tyler came into the project at the point, I mentioned that we've been doing this for a bit over 2 years, and that wasn't my intent. I would have loved to go out the first time, Pete to get his photo, a couple of months later, have it edited and completed, and that's that. It wasn't that simple. The image was not obtained the first time. And you end up with all this footage, and this is my first long-form documentary. So it's been a big learning experience for me. So to have Tyler's experience and great editing skills on board, it's been a lifesaver and really pulled the project out of a rut it was in at the time. And the other interesting thing is I was hoping to have it finished to show you a finished product at this point. And it's not finished. It is definitely a rough cut. There are elements that we're still missing. Peter and I plan to go up to Old Crow for the Caribou Days Festival in May, and he's going to go out again from there to try to get this unique image. I think it's really important. It is a POV documentary told from Peter's own point of view, obviously, but I think it's very important to have the Gwitchin perspective in there firsthand to speak for themselves within the documentary. And so there are themes and elements that are missing currently. So keep that in mind when you're watching. It's not complete. The story structure is going to shift. I just arrived because I was fine-tuning the audio so I don't deafen you. Often when you're at rough cut stage, the audio levels aren't balanced. So it's probably sounding a lot like I sound now. But I did get it a bit better, so hopefully it's all going to be audible and accessible. I'd also like to thank Naomi Mark, who helped filmed with Vivian Ballack, the story editor, Peter's last day of school. There's multiple elements to the story. One of them is the conflicts that happen within your own life when you're chasing your passions. Peter first got introduced to Old Crow as a teacher. So he taught in Old Crow and got inspired and connected with the people there about 20 years ago. And I think that is when, I wish Peter was here to speak for himself. He's not. He's currently in Alaska on a wolverine project. So thus is the life of a wildlife photographer, I guess. Yeah, Peter taught in Old Crow, and I think that was where it kind of got him thinking about this project. He's since had a conservationist background. He's been a teacher, and Naomi Mark helped film his last day of school. So we've filmed his transition from having his day job that conflicts with his passion job over to allowing him to be a full-time photographer. And from there, I think, because the first trip we did was very, very difficult, we got dropped off in the wrong location, and Peter says at the start of the documentary, 70 kilometres away. It actually turned out to be about 120 kilometres away from where the caribou were expected to be passing through. Our goal was to intercept them and set up the camera traps and get this image. It wasn't to be that time. So I thought I would show you some caribou footage from our second trip, where we were able to see the caribou much more up close. Actually, some of that footage was already seen in Patagonia. And I think that illustrates the point as well of how difficult it is to film this, particularly this winter migration. Patagonia has a lot of money. Patagonia would not have chosen me, possibly Peter, probably Peter, actually. Peter's incredibly talented, to have their imagery involved. But when they called us up because they knew we'd done this trip, and we're sort of picking our brains about the logistics of getting out there and timing it and talking to biologists and the weather and the varied routes for the migrations. And I think they said, like, okay, maybe we'll just go with your footage. That sounds a little bit easier because they had a timeline. And yeah, I think that illustrates the point that it's difficult. But I'd like to share some of that footage with you and then go into the documentary. It's currently at 30 minutes long. And then potentially if you have questions, I think, okay, the other thing I wanted to bring up was I thought it was going to be finished by now. So when 2 weeks ago I was not close to being finished, I emailed the event organizers and voiced my concerns that I'm going to be showing a rough cut. Is that going to be okay? Are you going to be mad? And they were very supportive. So sincerely appreciate that. But initially I was concerned. Then I thought, what a great opportunity, because in a room with caribou enthusiasts, or at least people that are curious enough to come to this event to learn more about caribou, I would sincerely like to hear your thoughts on what works, what doesn't, what's it missing, that was confusing. I would love to hear your thoughts, whether that's in the foyer outside, or if we do have time for a couple of questions, it would be great to have Tyler up as well. And yeah, I'd sincerely appreciate to hear what you have to say about it. So I'll go ahead and play some caribou footage, followed by the 30-minute documentary itself. Thanks so much.
And she studies how public stories told by First Nation communities and environmental groups influence decision-making about energy infrastructure projects in northwestern North America, which is where we are. She's a former executive director of YCS, and she has a long history of working with environmental and social justice groups in Canada and Europe. She is a hiking, biking, and skiing enthusiast, loves spending time outside, and is inspired by all of those who have worked tirelessly to protect wild places for future generations. And so I'll turn it over to you now, Shirley. Thank you.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Because I'm going to show some slides, you can't actually see me right now, and I can't see you. So I just want to make sure, is the sound, everything's working okay? Yes? Okay, I am talking now. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I don't know. Does anybody want to call me? Okay. All right. Anybody want to call me on my cell phone? No. Yeah. Yeah. She knows she can't be heard. Yes. All right. Yes, I'm speaking. I'm trying. Can you hear? Can you hear me? All right. So can you hear me? Okay, I have to go, but I'm just going to start and hope it goes all right. So, thank you for having me. I'm really delighted to be here. And thanks to YCS and the Porcupine Caribou Management Board, Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation, and of course the NGS Center. And I also wanted to give some thank yous to all the organizations that I work with to do my research on being caribou and all the folks who funded that research. As mentioned, my talk is called Changing Hearts and Minds Through Caribou Stories. And I'm really, to give you a quick outline, going to focus on the story of the Being Caribou film. So the issue of the Arctic Refuge, which has been talked about a bit already, some background on the Being Caribou film, the ways that it was used at a time when the refuge was really, really endangered in 2004 to 2005, and what we can learn from that as far as telling caribou stories to help protect the Arctic Refuge today. So I don't want to spend too long on the Porcupine Caribou because you've just had 2 wonderful days of activities and learning about just how important the herd is for ecosystems, for subsistence, for culture, and for northern communities. And you've talked a little bit about how there's big oil and gas development and potential in certain areas of the north. And one of these areas where there's a lot of desire to drill for oil and gas is in what's called the 1002 lands, which are that red area at the top of the map. And just to the left, you can see how there's all those little dots of oil and gas development. So that little band is the area where the Porcupine Caribou calve. And obviously, it's a crucially ecologically sensitive area when those caribou are calving. And what happened at the end of the 1970s was Alaskan legislation was passed establishing parks and protected areas, and it was so controversial what to do with this calving ground that they took it out of the legislation and determined that its future would be decided by the entire American Congress. And so that had a huge impact because suddenly we've been talking mostly about stewardship of the porcupine caribou by local communities in the north and decision making that way. But now, in the case of these calving grounds, the choice on what would happen to them was decided by voters and by senators all across America. So suddenly, the people from the communities that had the strongest stake in how those caribou were going to be protected in their calving grounds had to go to Washington and had to lobby all across the United States of America. So you might recognize some of these folks here. The Gwitchin Nation took, lots of First Nations in Inuvialuit worked on a political level with governments on this issue, but the Gwitchin took a strong lead in terms of that public element. That element of going, okay, we have to go out and we have to talk in the world and share our stories with people. Often just in person. Sometimes this is Elaine Alexie from Fort McPherson, and she made a film about the Peel and has been a strong spokeswoman about the caribou. But also people had to work in alliance because to reach all 50 states when there's not that many people in the north required partners. So for example, this man is Lenny Combe, and really sadly he passed away in 2004, but he worked with a group called the Alaska Coalition, which has hundreds of conservation groups and labor groups and church groups who were members. And what he did for 15 years of his life was travel to Gwitchin communities and often get Gwitchin speakers to come and travel with him while he gave slideshows, what he called the Great Wilderness Slideshows, but were really slideshows about the Arctic Refuge, and he gave them all across North America. And he reached between 100 and 4,000 people just through the slideshows he did. And many people did this, you know, and there were many Gwitchin, went on many different tours, so did Caribou Commons and other groups you know about. And so by the early 2000s, the issue of protecting the Arctic Refuge was the most well-known conservation issue in the United States, which was a pretty big thing for what is kind of an obscure, what was an obscure area to people 20 years before. But the reason it became so well known was because there continued to be so many close votes in Congress about its future and whether or not there'd be oil and gas development. And so in that environment, when Bush was elected in the early 2000s, there was a lot of pressure on the Arctic Refuge to open it and to open those calving grounds. And at that time, the two folks that I guess Sebastian mentioned at the beginning, Karsten Hoyer and Leanne Allison, became involved in the issue because Karsten Hoyer was a park warden in Nunavik, and he saw the porcupine caribou migrating across the Firth River and was really moved by how incredible their efforts were. And he thought if the whole world could just see this and could just know how difficult that caribou's journey is, it would make a real difference. So he and Leanne got together and they consulted with a lot of different groups and communities in the north, and they came up with a plan to do an expedition where they would follow the caribou and then tell stories about it through a film and through a book and children's book and other means. And you're going to see the film shortly. That's exactly what they did. So I don't want to give away too much of the film, but you know, you can see they went through a lot of different harrowing issues with landscapes and bugs and bears and crossing raging rivers. But a couple of things that were really special I just want to mention for the film in its time was that it did give a really intimate close-up picture of the porcupine caribou herd. You know, nowadays we have things like drones where you see animals close up, but then it was a real achievement that they spent so much time with that herd and got so close, and it's really reflected in the film. And the other things that are special about the film is they did do a lot of consultation. So when they finished their journey and before they made their stories into media that other people could see, they went back and they talked to people in those northern communities again, and that had a real impact on how they understood some of their experiences and some of the things they included in the film that, for example, reflect traditional knowledge of life on the land. Or another example is they went to Alaska Wilderness Week, which happens, it happened twice a year at that time. And basically it was a gathering of advocates from the Alaska coalition with Gwitchin people and with others who could teach them how to meet with their Congress people, how to be effective in their communities in trying to help protect the Arctic Refuge. And the film, as you'll see when you see it, brings in that perspective from having been at Wilderness Week. And this made it really effective in what I want to talk about next, which is that in 2004, they came back to Wilderness Week as one of the first places where they launched the film, and people really loved it. But then 6 weeks later, George Bush was reelected with a huge majority of Republicans who wanted to open the Arctic Refuge to oil and gas drilling. And everybody realized that the next year was going to be just a crucial time and that it would be all hands on deck. Everybody had to campaign their absolute hardest if they didn't want to lose those votes in Congress. And so the members of the Alaska Coalition got together and they decided that they would have a year-long campaign and that they'd have what they called Arctic Action Days before big votes. And they said, well, what can we do to really bring people in on the ground and get more people interested and compelled by this story on the first Arctic Action Day? And what they decided was that they wanted to do a living room screening campaign. So they bought thousands of copies of the Being Caribou DVD, because in those days you couldn't really distribute over the internet in the same way. And they provided volunteers in the Alaska Coalition with packages on how to organize a video party, where they got the DVD, they got information, they got sign-up sheets, they got more details on actions you can take and how you can help people to take actions with you. And then they asked people for this day to host a video party either in their home or at a community gathering place with some community they were connected to. So it could be your church or faith group, it could be your kayak club, it could be whatever. And people would show the film and then get up and say, listen, this story is my story too. It really matters to me because of whatever. And then they would say, will you join me right now and help me write a letter or come to this demonstration or do whatever that action was to help make a difference. And so I kind of researched what happened and how that rolled out. And I found that it was a really successful activity, that it helped new people get involved and other people to step up and take on some leadership. Because it didn't seem so scary to organize a video party. And once they did it and once they got charged by that experience, they wanted to do more. So about 300,000 people watched Being Caribou at about 2,700 screenings on this first Arctic Action Day in March. And it was a really good beginning to this period where there were at least 9 attempts to open the refuge to drilling, and people really had to, get out there and, let politicians know that that wasn't what they wanted. So I thought I would, since you're in Whitehorse, although I'm not, I thought I would show you what this looked like on the ground in Whitehorse. Some of you may remember from being there at that time. This is a photo of Erica Hoyer and Matthew Lien, who were 2 of the community organizers involved, because the film, Erica just started screening the film every week at Hellaby Hall after it had premiered at the Available Light Film Festival, and the NFB was touring it in the communities. And people were so interested, she just kept showing it every week, and every week people would stay after the film. And eventually, the people themselves came up with this idea to organize a demonstration because there were some Alaskan politicians who were coming to the legislature. And to quote Erica, what she said is that the people at the screenings are the ones who decided we should have a demonstration, which I am sure is why it was so successful. Because out of 24 screenings, when you get people from the audience deciding, submitting this idea, putting it forward and building it and getting excited about it, and that happens from meeting to meeting to meeting with different people all the time, by the time you have that demonstration, all those people, or a good portion of them anyways, will show up. So it was great. It left a mark. And I always think that these things individually, maybe they don't get that net change that you want, but they contribute to the positive energy from which other ideas can spring, other activities can spring, and other actions can spring that ultimately will result in the change that you want. And so this demonstration, you can see Yukon Elvis in the corner. In the other side, you can see that after they all did the demonstration outside, people put on Save Anwar t-shirts and surrounded the politicians in the legislature. It was very successful, and hundreds of people came out, and it was covered locally, it was covered in the national media, and it was a really good turning point, because the only vote that was ever lost was the very first vote in this year-long campaign, a few days after the first big March screening day of Being Caribou. But people kind of dug a little deeper. They thought, well, if the caribou can work so hard to get to those calving grounds, and this couple can be so committed to go through so much to bring this story, and Gwitchin can work so hard, then maybe the rest of us can do a little more. And the kind of energy that came from these protests, and from people sharing pictures of the protests and coming together and just seeing their power, helped to everybody to dig deeper and to sustain a really powerful effort over more than a year. And I don't want to belittle that parts of that year was really hard. So, for example, I interviewed Minnie Gwitchin, who said, well, to tell when your whole life and your whole culture is on the line and it means so much, it can be really challenging to just tell someone your story. But the other thing is, even at a personal level, it could also be really powerful and really affirming to tell about your experience and to build solidarity. And politically, it really is the telling of these caribou stories from just a small number of northern people and northern communities that was able to create alliances and influence the most powerful nation in the world, so that today, while it's still not permanently protected, it has yet to be drilled. And so keeping that knowledge circulating and keeping those stories about the calving grounds going is really, really important. And there's a little handout that I made because I was asked to, that's a bit more practical, that talks about how you can take a first step to share stories about issues that you're concerned about with others, because often it's easy to be afraid of being rejected or thinking you might be imposing. But the flip side is that to share your story and to ask someone to help you is to create a point of connection and to bring them into the fold and say that they're important and that you want them to be a part of your common concern. And it's also an opportunity to learn something new and to see the world in a different way. And I really think in the last 2 days, with the activities, the cookbook and the crafts and everything, those of you who've had the privilege to be there have seen just what a gift comes from sharing these stories and the incredible depth and richness that they're bringing. And, as we're moving forward continually in trying to protect the calving grounds again under Trump, I think these news stories are so powerful and so important. And I guess the last takeaway I just want to say is that for me, every time I see the film Being Caribou, it does remind me why the caribou are so important and why the relationship that the caribou have to the land and that we have to the land and to the caribou is so important and spiritual and vital, and really shows how we're all interconnected. So I hope that you will get something really wonderful out of the film, whether it's your first time seeing it or your 50th. And I want to say thank you and give you an opportunity for questions, but I also want to say the Arctic Refuge issue is going to be in the news, and I hope you will all stay connected to the Porcupine Caribou Management Board, NYCS, and Vuntut Gwitchin, and be a part of that ongoing effort. So that's it. And now I'm going to try to unshare my screen so that you can see me. Hang on. Uh-oh. More technical problems. Oh, I'm going to stop it. Maybe you need to turn your camera on. Can you see me?
Yep, I can see you.
Okay, I can only see the big.
I don't see anything though, so I haven't got a light on. So 1 second. Okay, that's
all right.
A bit better. Now I can actually see the function. So, does anybody have any questions for Shirley? In that case, you're got off easy. Oh, we do have a question. Sorry, Marty has a question.
Great. I can't see anything, by the way.
I'd just be interested to hear your perspective on the current political climate with the Trump administration and the potential risks for ANWR at the moment compared to that time you're reflecting on at the early 2000s.
Well, I actually think some of the other folks who are there today would be better able to answer that. I mean, it's definitely foregrounded. It's much more of a concern than it was under the Obama administration, that's for sure. The day after the election, a bunch of Gwitchin people actually went down to Washington and, along with the Alaska Wilderness League, revisited a bunch of senators and got, at the time, I think they got 37 people signed on. And there was a symbolic effort that some of these senators had to try to pass another bill to protect the refuge, which clearly they weren't, just because it was majority Democrat and it wasn't enough, it wasn't going to pass. But I think it was a way of sending a message to say people are really working on this effort, and it wouldn't be it wouldn't be easy for a Republican majority just to pass a bill and open the refuge, but it's certainly a time of concern because it is an objective of Trump's and it's an objective of politicians in Alaska, and there are those Republican majorities, and there are very good relationships, with even Republicans like John McCain as well as with Democrats. And so there's a bipartisan support for protecting the refuge, but it's pretty precarious. And unless they have an actual vote to try to open it, it's hard to know exactly what those numbers are. So I guess what I would say is it's definitely a point in time where it's important to foreground the issue and talk about it and work on it. It's challenging. I don't think it's completely bleak. I definitely think the fact that they were successful under Bush, there's been scenarios like this before, and people have been successful, and I think they can be again. So.
Thank you. Did I see another hand up? Okay. Then thank you, Shirley.
Thank you.
And we will move on to the movie.
Okay, I'm going to hang up.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.